client understands their behavior. They understand where it comes from. They can even explain their patterns quite clearly. And yet, they still find themselves reacting in exactly the same way.
Awareness is important beginning, but it is rarely the entire solution. In fact, when we observe behaviors closely, we often see that many responses happen before conscious thinking even begins. When we talk about psychological patterns, we are essentially talking about repeating loops of experience. Gradually, the person's world becomes smaller, even though the person understands that avoidance is limiting their life. The emotional relief it provides keeps reinforcing the pattern over and over again. The mind is constantly observing situations, interpreting them, and drawing conclusions out of them. But it doesn't just store information, it also stores associations between experiences, emotions, and responses. Familiarity can sometimes be mistaken for comfort. Even if the experience itself is unpleasant, the emotional structure of the experience feels known. So the mind continues recreating it.
Pattern almost becomes like closed loop. Experience reinforces belief, belief influences interpretation, interpretation triggers emotion drives behavior, and behavior recreates the experience once.
Insight is extremely valuable. Understanding past experiences can bring clarity and emotional relief. But insight alone does not always change automatic responses.
Let me start with a situation that many therapists and coaches will immediately recognize. Imagine sitting with a client who says something like, I know exactly why I do this. I understand my childhood. I know my triggers, but I still keep repeating the same pattern. And at that moment, many therapists quietly find themselves wondering if the client understands the problem, why does the problem still continue? What if the problem is not lack of insight, but the invisible pattern underneath? And until that pattern is understood, and more importantly, transformed, the same experience often keeps appearing in different forms. So today's episode explores these invisible psychological patterns. I'm your host, Nikki Pandey, a cognitive hypnotic psychotherapist and founder of 3 with Nikki. And I'm really excited about today's conversation because to explore this topic further, I'm joined by psychologist, trainer, and co-founder of ICHARS, Nitin Shah, who has spent decades training therapists in an integrative approach called cognitive hypnotic psychotherapy or CHP. Now, what intrigued me when I first heard about CHP was this idea that many psychological trainings are not just about thoughts or emotions, but about patterns that operate across multiple levels of the mind. And that sometimes the reason clients remain stuck is because therapy addresses one level, but the pattern is being maintained somewhere else. So today, I'm curious to explore this idea further. How do these patterns form? Why do they repeat? And how does an approach like cognitive hypnotic psychotherapy work with them? So, Nitin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Nidhi, for hosting this podcast. And I'm really looking forward to this interaction again because it is a common challenge that a lot of practitioners and clients face. And let's see where this conversation takes us today.
Yeah, so the situation I described earlier, is, I think, something I think many therapists have experienced. A client understands their behavior, they understand where it comes from, they can even explain their patterns quite clearly. And yet, they still find themselves reacting in exactly the same way. So the question that naturally comes up here is, why doesn't insight automatically create change? Because from the outside, it feels like if someone understands the problem, the solution should become easier. But that's often not what we see in the therapy rooms, right?
So that's a very important observation. And the reason this happens is because insights work mainly at the level of the conscious mind. But many of the patterns that maintain behaviors operate at deeper levels of mind. So when a client says, I know why I do this, but I still do it, what they are often describing is a gap between their conscious understanding and the automatic patterns that are being run by the unconscious. The conscious mind may understand the pattern, but the emotional and behavioral systems may still be operating based on earlier learning. For example, someone may understand their anxiety very clearly. They may know exactly why certain triggers trigger them. And yet, when the situation appears, when that trigger appears, the body reacts before the conscious mind has time to intervene.
In a way, the client's mind it understands the pattern, but the pattern itself is running automatically in the head.
Exactly. You can think of it almost like this: insight helps the client see the pattern. But seeing the pattern and changing the pattern are two different processes altogether. And this is something we often explore in cognitive hypnotic psychotherapy. In CHP, we look at how problems usually are maintained across multiple layers of mind. For example, a pattern may involve thought processes, emotional responses, conditioned reactions, beliefs about self and others, and sometimes even deeper identity structures. When all these layers reinforce each other repeatedly, the pattern becomes automatic. So, even when the client understands the pattern intellectually, the other layers may still continue operating them.
Yeah, because I think many people assume that once you become aware of something, the mind should automatically change. But what you're describing here suggests that awareness is just one part of the process.
True, awareness is important beginning, but it is rarely the entire solution. In fact, when we observe behaviors closely, we often see that many responses happen before conscious thinking even begins. For example, imagine someone who has the pattern of reacting defensively during conflicts. Later, they may reflect and say, I wish I hadn't reacted like that. But in the moment, the reaction happened almost instantly. In fact, when the same situation repeats again, the chances are they would end up behaving in exactly the same manner while they have the same understanding. Why does this happen? Because the mind has already learned a certain emotional response pattern. Once that pattern is triggered, the reaction happens automatically. The conscious mind often understands the reaction after it has already happened. And just on a side note, when we spoke about awareness and change, almost everyone in the world recognizes that if I learn to accept myself and others the way we are, our problems will probably resolve. We all know this intellectually, and yet how many of us are able to do it? So awareness is one part, change is a different ball game altogether.
So, what you're saying is that in a sense, the insight comes after the reaction, not before it, right?
In many cases, that's exactly what happens. And this is where many therapeutic approaches start exploring something deeper. They start asking questions like: how did this pattern form? What reinforces it? What emotional responses are attached to it? And how can those responses be changed? In the CHP approach, we often look at how patterns are formed through learning experiences over time. The mind learns certain associations, certain emotional responses get conditioned, certain behaviors become habitual, and gradually these responses become automatic. Once that happens, the person may understand the behavior intellectually, but the emotional and behavioral pattern may still continue.
So, it's almost like the mind has created a kind of internal program. And even if you understand the program still continues, it continues to run unless something changes at that deeper level.
That's a good way of putting it. The mind is constantly learning from experiences. Every time a behavior is repeated and reinforced, the pattern becomes stronger. Over time, these patterns can begin influencing how the person interprets situations, how they feel emotionally, and how they respond behaviorally. So, in many cases, what we observe as a problem is actually a repeating pattern that has become self reinforcing. And that's why, in approaches like cognitive hypnotic psychotherapy, we spend time understanding not just the behavior itself, but the pattern that keeps recreating it. Because when we begin to identify that pattern clearly, we can start working with it in a much more structured way.
That I think makes sense. So instead of only asking, why did this happen? The question becomes something like, what pattern keeps recreating this?
That's true. And when therapists begin observing problems through the lens of patterns, they often start seeing things that were not obvious earlier. Because patterns tend to repeat across situations, across relationships, different phases of life. So when you start looking at these patterns, instead of just the event, the picture becomes a lot more clear.
Isn't that fascinating? Because what you are describing suggests that therapy is not only about understanding events, but it is about recognizing the structure of the pattern underneath those events.
Yes, and once the structure of the pattern becomes visible, we can begin working with it more effectively.
So, in the next part of our conversation, I'd actually love to explore this idea further. What exactly do these patterns look like? How do they form? And how do therapists begin recognizing them when they are working with clients? But then, in the previous section, you mentioned something that I found quite interesting. You said that instead of focusing only on the event or the behavior, therapists they should often benefit from asking a different question. Something like it should not just be why does this happen, but rather why what pattern keeps recreating this. So let's explore this idea a little deeper. When we talk about psychological patterns, what exactly are we referring to? Because from the outside, it often looks like different situations, different relationships, different problems. But somehow the client keeps ending up in very similar experiences. What exactly is repeating here?
So that's a good question. When we talk about psychological patterns, we are essentially talking about repeating loops of experience. These loops usually involve several interconnected elements. For example, a situation occurs, the person interprets that situation in a particular way. That interpretation triggers a certain emotional response. The emotion leads to a behavioral reaction, and the behavior produces an outcome. Now, if that outcome reinforces the original interpretation, the loop strengthens. We also call this a self fulfilling prophecy or a self fulfilling loop. So, the next time a similar situation appears, the same sequence gets activated again. Over time, this sequence becomes automatic. And that's what we start observing as a pattern. In many cases, the loop looks something like this: trigger, interpretation, emotion, behavior, outcome, and reinforced belief. Once this loop repeats enough times, the mind begins running it automatically.
It's almost like a cycle. A
True.
trigger happens, the mind interprets it, emotions get activated, behavior follows, and the result strengthens the whole cycle again.
In fact, you can think of it as a self reinforcing loop. And this loop often operates much faster than conscious thinking and at a level that is far deeper than conscious awareness. Which is why people sometimes say things like, I don't even know why I reacted like that, or I realized what I did only afterwards. By the time the conscious mind begins analyzing the situation, the pattern has already played itself out.
That's interesting because From the outside, it sometimes looks like the person is making the same choice again and again. But what you're describing suggests that these responses may actually be happening automatically.
Yes, and many times they are. And this is something we explore deeply in the approach that we follow, in the work that we do. We often look at those patterns and we explore how patterns develop through repeated learning experiences. Each time a person reacts in a certain way and that reaction produces a certain result, the brain records that sequence. Over time, the mind begins to expect similar outcomes in similar situations, and gradually the response becomes habitual.
So the pattern is not just a behavior, it's also the way the situation is interpreted.
In fact, interpretation is often one of the most important parts of the pattern. Two people can experience the same situation and react very differently because what really shapes the response is the meaning a person gives to that situation. For example, imagine someone who grew up in an environment where criticism was very common. Over time, the mind may begin interpreting even neutral feedback as criticism. So, when a colleague says something simple like, maybe we could try doing it this way, the mind may interpret it as, I did something wrong. That interpretation triggers discomfort. The discomfort triggers defensiveness. And the defensive behavior may create tension in the interaction. So, what began as a neutral situation becomes a conflict. And when the conflict happens repeatedly, the person begins believing people are always criticizing me, which strengthens the pattern even further.
That sounds fascinating because from the outside, the colleague might have had no intention of criticizing at all. But the pattern changes how the situation is perceived.
And that's why patterns often recreate themselves even when external situation changes. The person may change jobs, they may change relationships, they may change environments, but if the interpretation of the pattern remains the same, similar experiences may continue reappearing.
The pattern is almost like a filter through which situations are interpreted, right?
That's a good way of describing it. The pattern influences how situations are interpreted, what emotions are activated, what behaviors follow, and what conclusions the person draws from the outcome. And once these elements reinforce each other repeatedly, the pattern becomes quite stable.
And I suppose that's why people sometimes say things like, why does this keep happening to me? Because from their perspective, it feels like the same situation keeps showing up.
Exactly. But when we examine the patterns closely, we often see that it is not always the same situation repeating. It is the response pattern that is repeating. And the repeating response creates similar outcomes. So the person begins experiencing similar results across different contexts. And this is important because when a client says that, why is this happening with me repetitively? It's almost that the locus of control is external. It's situations that they can't control. But the moment we start realizing that it's the response patterns that are repeating, and it's this repeating response that's creating similar outcomes. Now, the locus of control is with the client because they have the ability to break those patterns.
And Nitin, this also explains why insight alone might not be enough. Because even if someone understands the pattern intellectually, the emotional and behavioral parts of the loop may still continue operating automatically.
That's true. Insights help the client recognize the pattern, like I mentioned earlier. But the pattern itself may still continue operating until the emotional responses and the behavioral habits within that loop begin to change. That's why, in approaches like cognitive hypnotic psychotherapy, we often work with multiple levels of patterns simultaneously. Not just the thought, but also the emotional response, the conditioned behavior, and sometimes even deeper beliefs or assumptions that support the pattern.
therapy becomes less about analyzing one specific event and more about recognizing the entire structure of the pattern underneath.
That's correct. Once the pattern becomes visible, it becomes much more easier to understand why the same experience keeps reappearing. And when the therapist and the client can clearly see the pattern together, that often is the moment when real change begins to become possible.
The way you explained patterns in the previous section makes a lot of sense conceptually. But I imagine that for many therapists listening to us, the real question is, what do these patterns actually look like in therapy? Because when you are sitting with a client, the client usually talks about specific problems or situations. They might talk about a relationship conflict, work stress, anxiety, or lack of motivation. But the pattern itself may not be immediately obvious. So, could you walk us through some real examples of how these patterns show up in therapy?
That will be an interesting way to understand this. So let's explore this. So, okay, let me begin with a relationship pattern. One very common pattern that appears is in relationships. Imagine a client who repeatedly finds themselves attracted to emotionally unavailable partners. In the beginning of the relationship, everything feels exciting. There is intensity, there is emotional investment. But gradually, the client starts feeling that the partner is distant, difficult to reach emotionally, or inconsistent in their attention. And eventually, the client begins feeling rejected, insecure, or anxious. Now, when this happens for the first time, it may look like a relationship problem. But when it happens again and again and again across different relationships, we begin asking a different question. What is the pattern here? When we explore deeper, we sometimes discover that the client grew up in an environment where emotional attention was inconsistent. Perhaps affection came occasionally but not reliably. Perhaps approval had to be earned. Perhaps emotional closeness was unpredictable. So the mind becomes familiar with a certain emotional dynamic, the feeling of trying to earn connections. And when the person grows older, they may unconsciously feel drawn towards patterns who recreate that same emotional dynamic. Not because they consciously want suffering, but because that emotional pattern feels familiar. And familiarity often feels like attraction. So even though the client may intellectually understand the pattern, they may still find themselves emotionally drawn to similar partners.
That's again fascinating because from the outside, it might look like the client is simply making poor relationship choices. But what you're describing suggests something deeper is influencing those choices.
And once the therapist and the client begins to recognize the pattern, the focus of therapy shifts. Instead of asking only why did this relationship fail, we begin asking what emotional patterns keep getting recreated and what can we do about them. So let's take maybe another couple of cases, right? So another pattern that therapists see very often involves anxiety. Imagine someone who feels anxious about public speaking. The first time they experience anxiety before a presentation, they avoid the situation. Avoidance immediately reduces anxiety. And this is where the brain learns something very powerful. Avoidance works. The next time anxiety appears, the mind remembers the previous situation, avoids again, and once again the anxiety reduces temporarily. So the pattern becomes anxiety, avoidance, relief. But what happens over time is that the situations that trigger anxiety begin expanding. First presentation, then meeting, then social interaction. Gradually, the person's world becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. Even though the person understands that avoidance is limiting their life, the emotional relief it provides keeps reinforcing the pattern over and over again.
I think this makes a lot of sense because the brain here starts learning from the immediate relief rather than the long term consequences.
True. And let me end this with one more case example to make it even more clearer. A pattern related to self worth. Imagine a client who carries a deep belief that they are not good enough. Because of this belief, they constantly try to prove their worth, they work extremely hard, they take on too many responsibilities, they rarely say no. They push themselves constantly. At first, this may even look like high achievement. But over time, the person becomes exhausted, they burn out. When burnout happens, they feel they failed, which strengthens the belief I am not good enough. And the pattern continues: belief, overcompensation, exhaustion, and reinforced belief.
Pattern is not just emotional, it's behavioral as well.
Most patterns involve both emotional and behavioral elements reinforcing each other. And that's why they become quite stable over time.
So, Nitin, what I find interesting about all these examples here is that the client might initially present very different problems: relationship issues, career struggles, anxiety, burnout. But when you look closely, what's repeating is not necessarily the situation. It is the underlying pattern which is repeating.
And that's one of the key shifts therapists experience when they start observing patterns. Instead of focusing only on individual events, they begin seeing repeating structures across different situations. Once that structure becomes visible, therapy becomes much more clearer. Because you're no longer working only with the surface problem, you're working with the patterns that generate the problem.
And I imagine that's where approaches like cognitive hypnotic psychotherapy become particularly interesting. Because if patterns operate at multiple levels, thoughts, emotions, behaviors, then therapy probably needs to work across those levels as well.
That's correct. And that's something we will explore a little more as we continue this conversation.
So those case examples really make the idea of patterns much clearer. And what stands out, I think, is that these patterns often seem to repeat for years, sometimes even decades. See, the natural question that comes up is why do these patterns form in the first place? Because nobody consciously decides that I want to keep repeating the same problem in my life. Yet somehow the mind seems to learn these patterns and then continue repeating them. How does that happen?
So that's something important for us to understand and pay attention to. To understand why patterns form, we need to understand something fundamental about how the human mind learns from experiences. The mind is constantly observing situations, interpreting them, and drawing conclusions out of them. But it doesn't just store information, it also stores associations between experiences, emotions, and responses. When certain combinations of experiences happen repeatedly, the brain begins to treat them as a pattern. Over time, the mind begins expecting similar outcomes in similar situations, like I mentioned earlier, and gradually the response again becomes automatic.
In a way, the mind is constantly trying to predict what will happen next based on the past experience.
And from the brain's perspective, that's actually very efficient. Because if the brain had to analyze every situation from scratch, it would take a lot of energy. So instead, the brain builds shortcuts. These shortcuts are essential patterns. If a certain response worked earlier, the brain assumes it will work again. And so it repeats the same process.
But sometimes the response that worked earlier may no longer be useful. Yet the brain continues repeating it.
Yes, and that's where many problems arise. Many psychological patterns begin as adaptive responses. At some point in life, the response may have served a purpose. For example, imagine a child growing up in an environment where expressing emotions led to criticism. The child may learn that staying quiet is safer. So the child develops a pattern of suppressing emotions. In that environment, the pattern may actually have helped the child avoid conflict. But years later, when the person is in adult relationships, the same pattern may prevent open communication. What once helped the person cope now begins creating problems.
Mind doesn't necessarily distinguish between past situations and present situations. It simply repeats what it has learned before.
Yeah, that's also because the unconscious prioritizes familiarity. Familiar responses require less effort, and familiarity often creates a sense of psychological safety. Even if the pattern is not ideal, it still feels predictable, and predictability reduces uncertainty. I'm sure you would have heard of this expression a known devil is better than an unknown angel, right? This kind of explains or illustrates what we are talking about very clearly.
No wonder people at times they want to stay in patterns that clearly don't make them happy. Yet they feel it feels strangely familiar and they prefer to stay in the same pattern.
And familiarity can sometimes be mistaken for comfort. Even if the experience itself is unpleasant, the emotional structure of the experience feels known. So the mind continues recreating it.
Thing I'm curious about it then is that the emotional part of these patterns. Because in many of the examples we mentioned earlier, emotions seemed to play a very big role.
Yes, emotions are very important part of pattern formation. Emotional experiences tend to be stored very strongly in memory. When an emotional experience happens repeatedly, the brain becomes very efficient at triggering that emotional response quickly. For example, if someone repeatedly experiences rejection in certain situations, the mind may begin anticipating rejection even before it happens. That anticipation itself triggers emotional reactions like anxiety or defensiveness. Those emotional reactions then influence behaviors, and the behaviors sometimes creates the very outcome the person was trying to avoid. So the emotional component becomes an important part of the pattern loop.
The emotion itself becomes a part of the pattern.
Yes, and this is one of the reasons why insights alone may not be enough to change behavior. Because even if a person understands the situation intellectually, the emotional response may still activate automatically. And therefore, we often explore how emotional conditioning interacts with thoughts, behaviors, and beliefs. When we see these elements together, we begin to understand the patterns much more clearly.
The thing that seems interesting here is how beliefs form within these patterns. Because in some of the examples that you gave earlier, the patterns seem to reinforce certain beliefs about the self or about the world.
So, like I said, patterns often create what we call as self fulfilling prophecies, and these are really self reinforcing belief systems. For example, if someone repeatedly experiences criticism, they may begin forming beliefs like people are always judging me or I am not good enough. Once those beliefs form, they begin influencing how situations are interpreted, and those interpretations trigger the same emotional response and behaviors. So the belief strengthens the pattern, and the pattern strengthens the belief.
Pattern almost becomes like a closed loop. Experience reinforces belief, belief influences interpretation, interpretation triggers emotion drives behavior, and behavior recreates the experience once, right?
And that's why the patterns can become quite stable over time. They are supported by multiple psychological mechanisms working together.
Which it explains why simply telling someone to think differently doesn't always change the pattern.
Yes, because the pattern may involve much more than just thoughts. It may involve emotional conditioning, behavioral habits, and deeply held beliefs. And that's why we recommend integrative therapeutic approaches because they work with multiple levels of the mind. When those levels begin shifting together, the pattern begins changing.
Okay, so this suggests that patterns are not random. They are actually the result of the mind learning from experience and trying to create predictable responses. But sometimes those responses become outdated.
Exactly. And once therapists understand how these patterns form, they begin observing them more easily in therapy. Because instead of looking only at individual problems, they start recognizing the learning process that created the pattern in the first place.
This brings us to another interesting question where therapists often miss the pattern. So before we get to the question, Nitin, what's becoming clearer through this conversation is that many psychological problems are actually maintained by repeating patterns. But if these patterns are so central, I'm curious about something. Why do therapists sometimes miss them? Because many therapists are trained to analyze behavior, emotions, and also the past experiences. Yet, these repeating patterns can sometimes remain hidden for quite a long time. Why does it?
That's a very thoughtful question. And I want to begin by saying that therapists miss pattern not because they lack skill or dedication. In most cases, it happens because the pattern itself is spread across multiple experiences. And while therapists are skilled at working with one or two levels, generally their ability to work across multiple levels is limited by the kind of training they've gone through. Each individual situation may appear different, different relationships, different workplace, different emotional trigger. So, if we focus only on the individual event, it can look like completely new problem each time. But when we step back and observe the larger sequence, we begin seeing the repeating patterns are having a structure underneath.
It's zooming in too closely on the event. We miss the bigger pattern. So we actually have to look at it from behind.
That's true. And let me share a few more common situations where this happens. So, first is sometimes therapy focuses heavily on current situations. For example, a client may come in with a conflict at work, so the session focuses on what happened in a particular incident. What was said, how the client felt, how they reacted, all of this is important. But if we only analyze the current incident, we might miss the fact that very similar conflicts have appeared in multiple places before. Perhaps the client had similar dynamics with previous colleagues or similar tensions in other environments. And when those patterns become visible, the focus of the therapy shifts from how do we solve this one situation to how do we address this pattern and how do we stop this pattern from repeating itself again. Will I
Any
just say
any
something
o-
in.
any other example or a situation that you have?
So, another common situation occurs when therapy focuses primarily on insight and understanding. Insight is extremely valuable. Understanding past experiences can bring clarity and emotional relief. But insight alone does not always change automatic responses. For example, a client might understand that their fear of rejection comes from an earlier experience in their childhood. They may recognize the origin of the fear. But when they enter a new social situation, the emotional response may still activate automatically. The body reacts before the conscious mind has time to intervene. So, even though the insight is correct, the pattern is still active. And we have already discussed this a few times earlier, right? So, this is another example. And then you have treating symptoms instead of patterns, which is also at times a major challenge that practitioners face. That while we recognize and we understand that it's important to work with symptoms because it's the symptom that the client comes to us with, but working with symptoms by itself may not be enough. Many a times symptoms relapse, and they relapse because deeper layers have not been addressed. And the deeper layers are not addressed because we are just observing the symptoms rather than observing the patterns and where those patterns are coming from. Right? So these are few of the examples that I can give you. Why many a times practitioners miss out on these patterns.
Of asking only what is the client thinking or what is the client feeling, one should also look at how these pieces interact together.
That's very correct. And when we see how these elements interact, the pattern becomes clearer, more structured, and easier to work with. We can begin working with the mechanisms that maintain the pattern.
It also seems like this way of observing journeys requires stepping back a little. We are able to look at the client's experiences across time instead of just within a single situation.
So we do both. We explore clients' experiences within single situations also, and then we also see if there is a pattern that can become visible over several observable situations together, right? And these situations could again be relationship conflicts, workplace challenge, social interactions. At first glance, they may all appear unrelated, but when you look closely, you sometimes see the same emotional response, the same interpretation, and the same behavioral reaction repeating across these different contexts. And that's when the pattern becomes even more clearer, even more evident.
Which must be a very powerful moment in therapy, I'm sure. Because once both the therapist and the client can see the pattern, the problem starts making much more sense.
And many clients actually feel a great sense of relief when the pattern becomes visible because suddenly their experience stops feeling random. They begin seeing the structure behind their reaction, and that clarity often becomes the starting point for real change.
That's
Again, like I said earlier, because instead of the control being external, the client recognizes that these are repetitive behavioral patterns which are in their control, and they can learn to change those patterns and thereby change the experiences.
That makes a lot of sense. Once a pattern is visible, therapy can begin focusing on not just solving the individual situations. They can, the therapist can also help the client develop a new pattern here.
And that's where the real transformation begins.
So, in the next section, I'd love to explore the most practical question of all. Once a therapist recognizes a pattern, how do they begin helping the client change it? Because understanding the pattern intellectually, that we already said earlier, it is one thing, but transforming it is something else. Why does this process usually, where does this process usually begin?
So that's an interesting question. It's interesting because it's very important. Let's break it down. One of the key principles that we emphasize in the integrative approaches that we follow is that patterns usually exist across multiple layers of mind, as I mentioned earlier. So, if we want to change a pattern effectively, we need to understand how these layers interact. For example, a repeating pattern might involve the interpretation of the situation, the emotional response, the behavior that gets triggered, and sometimes deeper beliefs or earlier experiences. Now, this is what we have already discussed earlier. The reason why it becomes important now is because this helps us organize the entire therapy process. And to organize the therapy process, we use a framework called the soft C. It's essentially a structure that helps therapists move from understanding the problem to helping the client create a new pattern.
That sounds interesting. What does it stand
So, soft C is an abbreviation. Each letter represents something. The first step is current situation. Here, the therapist helps the client describe the moment when the pattern appears. What exactly happened? What triggered it? What did the client think? What emotions appeared? What behavior followed? When you map these elements clearly, the pattern becomes much easier to see. And in order to do this, we generally help the client describe their patterns, we help them summarize their current challenges, and then we help them convert it into like a one line statement. The format of the statement is I feel dash about dash when dash. The idea is to be able to crisply define the current situation before we can go ahead.
So instead of vaguely saying, this keeps happening, the therapist helps the client slow down and examine the sequence.
The therapist helps the client slow down, examine the sequence, and then define it crisply in a short sentence, which becomes the starting point for the changes that we want to work towards, right? Or at least the changes that the client wants to create in their life. Now, once this problem statement or the current situation statement is defined, the next step is outcome. We help the client explore what their desired outcome is. What are they actually wanting to achieve through these therapy sessions and processes? For example, instead of reacting defensively, how would they like to respond? Instead of avoiding situations, what would a better response look like? That gives the mind a clear direction for change.
I think that makes a lot of sense because often clients only talk about what they want to stop, or they want not what they want to create.
That's true. And we don't just stop at helping them define what the desired outcome is. We actually take this a step forward. The next step in the soft C framework is creating a detailed, elaborate future. Here we invite the client to imagine what their life would look like if they've already started responding differently, if they've already achieved their outcome. How would they behave? How would they feel? What would others notice about them? This begins activating the brain's ability to mentally rehearse a new pattern.
Almost the mind starts practicing a new response before it actually happens.
Yes. And once the client's mind is aware of the future that we are working towards, remember we spoke about familiarity earlier? So you
Yeah.
are also making this future familiar for the client, right? So that the mind feels comfortable moving towards this future because it is already something that the mind has conceptualized, that the mind is aware of. Once the mind understands what this future is, once it starts becoming more and more familiar to this future, then we move to the next step, which is to help the client identify the tasks that they need to do to create this future and the triggers that are currently creating the current situations or the emotional responses that the client wants to change. This is where we identify what activates the old patterns and what might help the client respond differently. And depending upon what we discover, different techniques can be useful.
The techniques depend on which part of the pattern is more important.
That's true. And that is the reason why the work that we do is not just integrative, it's also very client centered. Because everything that happens in the process revolves around the experience that the client is having and the feedback that the client is giving to us. For example, if the pattern is driven by interpretation, we might use metamodel questions. These questions help the client examine assumptions behind their thinking. If a client says, everyone is judging me, we might ask, who exactly is judging you? How do you know that they are judging you? What evidence supports that conclusion? Sometimes just examining those assumptions can loosen the pattern.
Because the emotional reaction may have been triggered by an interpretation that wasn't actually accurate.
So, a couple of things. One, we are not saying whether the interpretation is accurate or not accurate because the client is stating certain information to us. Right now, we don't know whether this interpretation is correct or incorrect. Right? We don't know even if the client knows whether this interpretation is correct or incorrect. So, these questions really help us go on a journey where either the client recognizes that their interpretations are incorrect, or we realize that the interpretations may have been correct, but the client's ability to deal with the situation resulted in the compounding effect where the current interpretations holds true. And then we may work with the client to help them develop the skills required to manage those situations. Now, this is important to understand because sometimes the pattern is really about interpretation, in which case we have used the meta model. In some cases, the pattern may be about emotional reactions, which are contributing to the current environment, which is then leading to an interpretation which supports the client's current understanding. In which case, we may need to begin working with the emotional reactions first. And in those situations, we might use techniques like anchoring. Anchoring helps the client access a more resourceful emotional state like calmness or confidence when the old emotional reactions begins appearing. As a result, their ability to handle situations is better, and as such, the way their mind would interpret the end result will begin to change.
So now here, the client learns to change their state first.
Exactly. Once the state changes, the behavior often becomes easier to change as well.
What about the situations where the behavior itself has become automatic?
Then we might use techniques like swish. Swish helps the brain replace one automatic behavioral response with another. For example, someone who automatically withdraws during a difficult conversation may learn to visualize responding calmly instead. Over time, the brain begins activating the new response more easily.
That's interesting. So the brain is essentially learning a new behavioral shortcut.
Exactly. Now, sometimes patterns can also exist because of internal conflicts. Parts of the person wants change where another part is trying to protect them from something that will happen if they change. In those cases, techniques like parts integration or end step reframing can be very helpful. These techniques allow different parts of the person's mind to communicate and align their intentions so that instead of having an internal conflict, the parts can work together in a manner that they are aligned with each other towards the desired goal that the client wants to achieve.
Almost resolving an internal disagreement.
True. And it's actually far more severe than internal disagreement at times. It can be full blown internal conflicts that the client struggles with extensively. Now, when we are working with resolving these internal conflicts, sometimes therapists also explore where the patterns originally began. Many repeating patterns develop through earlier learning experiences.
You mean earlier life experiences?
Often, yes. In those situations, techniques like regression can be helpful. Regression allows the client to revisit earlier experiences where the emotional pattern was formed. The goal is not to relive the experiences, but to observe it with greater awareness and emotional resources. When the meaning attached to that earlier event changes, the emotional response linked to similar situations today often changes as well. Sometimes the pattern weakens simply because the emotional experiences that created it is finally processed and understood differently. And sometimes we may need to combine regression with other techniques to be able to help the client replace those emotions that were processed and then also identify certain learnings that they can implement in their life going forward.
Client begins relating differently to the experience that originally shaped the pattern.
That will be one way of putting it. Another approach that can be very useful to do the same thing is timeline work. Timeline techniques help the client step back and observe how the same patterns have appeared across different phases of their life. When the client sees the pattern unfolding across time, they often gain a powerful new perspective. From there, it becomes easier to change how they relate to those experiences. Again, regression, timeline, inner child, these are all different techniques, but they are all trying to work with the same phenomena and the underlying principles are also the same. But obviously, the way to implement them changes from client to clients because some clients respond better to one process, other clients respond better to other processes. Sometimes you just have to understand the concepts and create a new process that will work for the client.
And I think that must be quite powerful because suddenly the client realizes the problem isn't just one situation. It's something that has been repeating across different parts of life.
Yes, and that awareness when combined with the appropriate change processes, can be very, very empowering.
But then you mentioned something earlier that I found particularly interesting, the idea of working with both state and skill. Could you explain that a little more?
So, many a times, clients have the required skills required to address a particular situation. Let me give you an example. Let's say a client comes and tells you that I need patience to improve my relationship. Okay. There are a lot of conflicts happening in that relationship. But there are other relationships, other conversations, other situations where I'm very patient. So the client has the skill to be patient. They know how to talk to people in conflicting situations because in multiple areas of their life they're able to address conflicts effectively. And yet, in one specific situation, with one specific person, those conflicts they are not able to manage. The same patience, the same skills that they are applying effectively in other areas, they are not able to apply here. Why would that be happening? Because while they have the skills, they may not have the right emotional state to be able to apply those skills. Right? Because the moment they come across this person, they are immediately experiencing anger, frustration, irritation. That anger, frustration, irritation comes in the way of how effectively their mind can process the situation and respond to that. And as a result, even though they have the skills, they still are not able to apply. So, this is where people may have the skill, but the state is preventing them from applying the skill. And then you can have other situations where a person may just lack the skill. For example, in order to manage conflict, there are strategies that you can use. There are skills that you need to develop to be able to understand conflicts and know how to respond in that conflict. Even if you have the skill to be calm, even if you have the emotional state of being calm, if you don't know how to deal with a conflicting situation, how long do you think you will be able to sustain that calmness? So eventually that calmness will wean off simply because the fact that you're in a situation constantly which is conflicting, where there are conflicts that are taking place and you don't know how to manage that conflict and address that conflict, means eventually that calmness will disappear and then you will end up having a bigger problem. So this is what we mean by working with state and skill both. Sometimes you just need to work with one because the client already has the ability to make use of the other. At other times, you need to work with both. The objective is to align the two together towards the end goal.
Therapy helps align the emotional state and the behavior state.
True.
If I
And when
can.
these two align, the client can begin creating new responses where the old patterns used to appear.
And then the new experiences begin reinforcing the new pattern.
That's true. And in order for these new experiences to reinforce new patterns, there are a few other things that we do as a part of the soft C framework that I spoke about earlier. So, along with all the interventions that we've spoken about, we also help the client summarize all the changes that they need to create in their life in like a one line suggestion or a mantra. This becomes that mantra that the client can focus on consciously, repetitively to reinforce the insights that have emerged out of the work that we are doing with the client. We will also help the client evaluate from time to time where we work to begin with and what changes have taken place in their life. Because that evaluation also helps us understand how effectively we have worked with the client, what changes have worked, what new changes we still need to work with. And finally, to be able to help the client create all of these changes, we break the change process into manageable, digestible steps. Right? So we don't try to create the changes all together in a single go. We generally work with something called as an assignment, where every week we work with 3 or 4 symptoms and triggers where we want the client to be able to notice changes. Right? The client may do certain small experiments on a weekly basis for these test whether these symptoms still exist, whether these patterns are still repeating or not. These assignments are very important because this is where the brain learns most strongly from new experiences. And these experiments also help the client witness and notice the positive shifts that are taking place in their life, thereby showing them tangible results of the therapy that they are undergoing.
Instead of just talking about change, the client begins experiencing the change, right?
And those experiences gradually build into a new pattern. What many therapists find interesting is that when they start observing patterns this way, they often begin noticing connections in their clients' experiences that were not obvious earlier. And this awareness further assists the therapist in selecting the right therapy process and further assists the clients in developing confidence in the therapy that they are going through.
That makes a lot of sense because once you start seeing problems through the lens of patterns, therapy becomes much more structured and purposeful. And I think it also explains why integrative approaches like CHP can be useful because human behavior rarely operates at just one level.
That's very true.
So, Nitin, that has been really fascinating conversation. What stands out to me is how differently problems begin to look when you start observing them through the lens of patterns. Because often in therapy, we focus on individual events, a conflict, an anxious moment, a difficult decision. But what we've been discussing today, right from the start to here, is that that suggests that underneath many of these situations, there is actually repeating structure. And once that structure becomes visible, the entire problem begins to make more sense.
And that's exactly what many therapists experience. When they start looking for patterns rather than just individual problems, they begin noticing connections that were not obvious earlier. Situations that seemed unrelated suddenly start showing a similar emotional response, a similar interpretation, or a similar behavioral reaction. And that's when therapy becomes much clearer. Because instead of trying to solve each situation separately, the therapist can begin to work with the patterns that keep repeating those or keep recreating those situations. And the most fascinating and interesting part about this is the therapists don't have to analyze the patterns, understand the patterns, and explain the patterns to the client. In fact, the way our approach works, it's the client who is able to observe the patterns, analyze the patterns, and explain the pattern to us, which is incredible because this means that the chances of our interpretations, which may at times have biases, influencing the client's therapy process is almost nil, right? Plus the agency that the client has, the fact that they are able to observe their patterns, they are able to recognize the repetitive loop that they are stuck in, their ability to understand how their emotions were keeping them in this loop, and the fact that they can learn from those experiences and apply those experiences, apply those learnings in future experiences. This is something that the clients find very difficult to describe, but when you ask them, you know that this feeling is incredibly powerful, right? And all of this happens because we are able to provide the client with an opportunity to be able to explore, experience, understand this, and explain it to us rather than it being the other way around.
That's a very hopeful perspective, I think, because it suggests that change is not just about forcing ourselves to behave differently. It's about helping the mind develop a different pattern altogether.
Exactly. And that's why approaches that look at multiple layers of the mind can be particularly helpful. Because these patterns are rarely maintained just by one factor. They usually involve multiple layers, thoughts, emotions, behaviors, beliefs, positive intentions, sometimes past experiences, sometimes values. So these layers can be many. When therapy begins addressing all of these layers together, change occurs much more naturally.
The thing I think I found of interest over here in this conversation was how structured the process can be. Frameworks like SoftC help therapists organize their thinking, but at the same time, there is flexibility in the techniques used depending on the requirement of the client.
So the way we design the entire CHP approach in the soft C framework is that there has to be a skeleton which acts as a structure, right? That structure ensures that at every step of the therapy process, the therapist knows exactly what they are doing, what is the objective of this step, and what they would do next in terms of the objectives. But within each step, given the fact that every client is unique, there's a lot of flexibility. So while the first step is to define the current situation, what techniques you will utilize to help the client define the situation will change from clients to clients. If the client is able to verbalize their problems very clearly, very effectively, very quickly, the processes will be different. If the client comes and tells you, I don't know where to begin from, our entire approach can be very different. When we are asking the client to define the outcome, right? And the future. We may begin with helping the client describe it literally, or sometimes clients have difficulty in literally explaining what kind of futures they want to achieve, and therefore we may bring in more metaphorical processes to help the client explore it metaphorically, symbolically, and then help them connect it back to what they want to really achieve in their life. So, what I'm explaining to you is that yes, there's structure, and the structure is incredibly powerful. It provides immense clarity to therapists, but within that structure, there's a lot of flexibility to ensure that the unique aspect of client is respected and is what drives the entire therapy process.
I imagine that once therapists start seeing problems through this pattern perspective, they probably begin noticing it in many different situations.
Yeah, and very often that's what happens. Therapists begin recognizing similar patterns across different types of clients and problems. And that recognition allows them to work more effectively because they are no longer addressing only the surface issue, they are working with mechanisms that generate the issue.
That's a really powerful takeaway. Instead of asking only what is the problem, the therapist begins asking what pattern is recreating this problem.
And what patterns and what steps we can take to ensure that these patterns can be broken and can be replaced by new, more functional patterns for the client.
And Mikkel, thank you so much for sharing these insights today. I think this conversation will give many therapists and psychology students a new way of looking at the challenges their clients bring into therapy. And so perhaps even a new way of thinking about their own patterns as well. And to everyone listening and watching the iCharts channel. If today's conversation made you reflect on the patterns in your clients or even in your own life, take a moment to observe these patterns more closely. Because sometimes the most powerful change begins not only with trying harder, but with seeing the pattern clearly. And if if today's conversation made you curious about how therapists learn to work with patterns in this way, you might find some of the learning resources available on the website interesting as well. So, once again, thank you so much for being on this episode.
Thank you, Nidhi, for hosting this episode. And for those of you who will be watching this episode, I hope you found this conversation insightful and interesting. If you have any feedback, if you have any questions, please leave it in the chat box, leave it in the comment section. And if you have specific topics that you want us to create these podcasts on. Please share those topics with us, and we'll be more than happy to have more detailed conversation on those topics. In case of these specific questions which you feel may not really require full-fledged episodes, but specific questions, queries that you want us to address, every Friday we are live for Q&A with our interns. You can join us on the social platforms, generally YouTube, and at times also on LinkedIn, and ask your questions, and we'll be more than happy to take up those questions during that time. So thank you once again. Thank you, Nidhi, and I look forward to having more such conversations with you and with everyone else. Take care.
Thank you. Bye bye.